So I think, as in Rome 3, for Rome 4, I have the privilege of being the chair of the Questionnaire Development Committee. This diagnostic questionnaire, which we developed for the, basically translates the Rome criteria into a questionnaire for patients. It has been very influential because it's often used by pharmaceutical companies and other investigators for the basis for inclusion criteria in trials, and it's been the basis for a lot of epidemiologic research as well. So I'm chairing the committee. The members of the committee are Jan Tak, Ami Sperber, who's helping us with the cross-cultural issues this time around, Brennan Spiegel, Robin Spiller, Yung Sing Yang, two people who are representing the pediatric area, Lynn Walker and Miranda Van Tilburg, and my colleague Oliver Paulson. The questionnaire, I'm going to begin by telling you something about the first year of the questionnaire committee's accomplishments. We began by developing and validating new response scales. We wanted to move away from an ordinal scale, which we had used in Rome 3 and found to be relatively insensitive. We translated this into the kind of 10-point numeric scales that are preferred by many psychometricians and are now preferred by the FDA as well. We carried out a translatability analysis with Ami's guidance to look at whether the response scales were worded in ways that would be easy to translate into other languages. And we carried out a comparison in 50 IBS patients of the new scales to the old scales to be sure that they agreed with each other and that they were valid. We then carried out, prior to the last year's DDW, a symptom survey in a large number of adults and a large number of children in the US to just ascertain what is the normal prevalence of common GI symptoms that are the basis of the functional GI criteria. And the reason we felt that was important is that because the symptoms like abdominal pain and bloating are things that occur commonly in the healthy part of the population, we needed to know if we were setting realistic, clinically meaningful thresholds for how frequently these symptoms need to occur to be useful diagnostic categories. So we tried to survey the prevalence of occurrence of these symptoms in the general population. With the help of a market research company in the West Coast named Cint, we surveyed nearly 1,700 adults who were representative of the U.S. and about 1,500 mothers of infants and children, and have reported these things in reports to the working team so they could use them in developing criteria. And also, we've begun submitting reports to journals for the publication of these data. At this DDW meeting, we're presenting 2 posters and 3 oral papers based on this survey. So the timeline for the next tasks that the questionnaire committee will deal with are summarized in this slide. We will be drafting the Rome 4 questionnaire beginning soon after this DDW meeting and continuing through the end of this calendar year. We will not be able to finalize the questionnaire until after the Rome committees all meet in Rome in the beginning of December to finalize the criteria. During the same period of time, we'll be identifying investigators at 10 clinical sites that we can use for the clinical validation of the criteria and begin working with those sites to prepare IRB applications. We will carry out another translatability analysis beginning as soon as the draft questionnaire is completed, hopefully about the beginning of this calendar year and into January of next year. We'll carry out an understandability analysis in small groups of patients. This is a way of just checking to be sure that patients will understand what the questions mean. We will then carry out a clinical validation, which will take place during the first 9 months or so of 2015 and end with shortly before DDW, shortly before the deadline for DDW for 2016. and shortly before we need to submit the book for publication. The proposed validation process of this English version of the questionnaire will involve, again, selecting 10 clinical sites characterized by large volumes of patients with functional GI disorders, the existence of multiple clinicians at those clinics, which are providers familiar with the Rome criteria. We'll try to identify a research coordinator at each of those sites and to carry out a 6-month clinical validation study across these multiple sites. Each of these clinic sites will be asked to enroll 100 patients with functional GI disorders based on retrospective looking at their own medical records for the prior 3 months. They can enroll patients prospectively as well, but we are hoping for matters of efficiency to get the project done in a short time to enroll patients retrospectively for the most part. We'd like to target the most common functional GI disorders, IBS, functional dyspepsia, and functional constipation, but would invite them to enroll other types of functional GI disorders as well, or to enroll additional patients with one of these 3 categories of functional GI disorders for the validation process. The data collection will be carried out in 2 steps, basically. We'll identify research coordinators at each of the sites who will identify patients to invite, and we'll invite them to log on to a website and complete an anonymous questionnaire that's posted on a website. They'll be offered a $25 honorarium for completing the questionnaire. The website will assign them a study ID, and this will also give them directions for completing the questionnaire. The study IDs will keep the Data Coordinating Center, which will be at the University of North Carolina, ignorant of the identifying information about the patients, and conversely, we will keep the research coordinators and the investigators at the clinical sites ignorant or blinded to the questionnaire-based diagnoses that are made when the patients take the questionnaire. So the research coordinators at the clinical sites will then get a list of the patients who've completed the ID numbers, the patients from their sites who completed the questionnaire. They'll be asked to then input the data on the clinical diagnosis that was made prior to the patient taking the questionnaire, and some basic clinical characteristics of their workup, what diagnostic tests they've had, and so on. But the research coordinators and the sites won't be told the diagnosis made by the questionnaire, again, to maintain this double-blind aspect of the study. We'll also ask the research coordinators to identify 30 patients, more or less randomly from their sites, to take the questionnaire a second time about a month later so that we can retest reliability for the questionnaire. And we'll also enroll, again using a market research firm, sent 1,000 healthy controls to see how normal subjects in the population respond to the questionnaire. The likely sites for the validation study are summarized here. We haven't developed commitments from the site investigators as yet, but as you can see, many of them are people who are on the board of the Rome Foundation or who are historically affiliated with us, and many of them are people who've worked with all of you as consultants on your trials. They're an international group, but they are limited to investigators from English-speaking countries because we're, at this point, just validating the English version of the questionnaire. Tomorrow at the advisory council meeting, we'll describe to you a potential project to do a global validation as well, but this is just the validation of the English version. The anticipated outcomes from this trial are summarized here. We want to develop a table listing positive and negative predictive value, sensitivity, and specificity of the new Rome 4 questionnaire for each of these key clinical diagnoses. We'll be comparing each of the functional GI diagnoses to other patients with other GI diagnoses and comparing them to the healthy control group to see whether the questionnaire is able to do the hopefully easier task of discriminating health from disease. And that we will also conduct a qualitative assessment of the understandability of the questions by the patients and identify any feedback on barriers to administering the questionnaire at the clinical sites. Independently of this project on validating the adult questionnaire, we expect to carry out a clinical validation of the pediatric questionnaires as well. This will involve first just developing the Rome 3 pediatric questionnaires with the help of Lynn Walker and Miranda Van Tilburg and the members of the pediatric Rome working teams. They will assess the reliability, the test-retest reliability of these questionnaires and the concordance of the questionnaires between parent and child, because as you know, when we're assessing infants and toddlers, we have to depend on the reports of mothers or fathers. When we're assessing older children, it depends on their age, but we can sometimes look at the self-reports of older adolescents and compare that to their mother's reports. We'll look at the construct validity through a confirmatory factor analysis and the criterion validity by looking at the concordance of the questionnaire-based diagnoses to the diagnoses made by the pediatric gastroenterologists who enroll these patients. The methodology, again, is to develop the questionnaire, to assess face validity, to assess understandability in a small group of parent-child dyads, to then look at recruiting 50 patients from each of 7 clinical sites which are in a pediatric GI consortium. We will try to do the data collection in a 6-month period. Again, it will be done largely through internet collection of questionnaire data through the Data Coordinating Center at UNC. And I've said the last part there. So that concludes a description of the validation projects that we have planned. There are some other projects that we expect to carry out in the future, including, again, a global validation of the Rome 4 questionnaire. We're also discussing creating a website where clinicians can log on their patients at the point of care, at the clinic site, have the patient complete on a tablet computer or even a cell phone the questionnaire or sections of it, give an opportunity for the physician to enter red flags or other defining modifiers for the diagnosis, and then provide the clinician immediately with a recommended potential Rome diagnosis. And this website could also be used for clinical trials by having subjects just log on, take the questionnaire, get the inclusion criteria answered at that time.